How you guys doing today? It's Anthony Gangi. Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. Guys, great discussion we're going to have today. The first time you're told to look the other way. With that said, it could be because you're being told to look the other way as a rookie because maybe the senior officer or supervisor wants to try to make things more convenient, or maybe you're being told to look the other way because they're doing something they're not supposed to be doing. So you as a rookie, what do? And I've been getting a lot of comments on this because it does happen, and it puts the rookie in a bit of a circumstance. They want to be accepted by their peers, but also they want to do what's right, and it's not an easy decision. It's not. Well, let's just do it this way. It's not an easy decision to make, but we know what we need to do. But it's just not an easy decision to make because, again, you're working with these individuals, so there could be pressure. So how do we deal with the pressure and make sure that we keep our integrity in check? Now, guys, don't forget, I got some books on the market. This book just came out, Blue 360 Media, Daily Guide to Success for New Correctional Officers. A lot of information in here, guys. There's a lot. If you guys get a chance, I definitely get that book. And then I also got a few others on Blue 360 Media, but I also been releasing some ebooks. You have right now, I think they're $9.99 each. We got, let me just get rid of this little part here. We got Surviving Without a Mentor, 100 deep cut tips for rookie correctional staff. We got Rank Before Ready, 100 subtle survival tips for correctional leaders. Warden's Wisdom, this one's a big book, 100 subtle lessons in prison leadership. And we also have Corrections Interrupted, basically how to rebuild after a critical incident. And then don't forget, I still got Inmate Manipulation Decoded out there. I got Breaking Boundaries. I mean, we got some good books out there, along with the other books that are published on Blue 360 Media. And hopefully these ebooks will one day be soft cover. But in the meantime, I wanted to get those books out there. All right, so I got Joe. He's going to join in on today's discussion. What up, Joe?
What's happening, brother? How are you?
Good. Joe, you mind introducing yourself, please?
Yes, sir. My name is Joe Pomponi. I'm a retired lieutenant from the Texas Department of Corrections, 29 years, 6 months. I'm currently working as an assistant jail administrator in our local sheriff's department in the jail division, and I'm a panel member here for Tier Talk.
Yes, and we love having you. Now, Joe, we dealt with this the first time you're told to look the other way. I mean, most of the time I've dealt with it, it's usually because people are trying to find a more convenient way to do something, or the supervisor doesn't want to be bothered by more work. But obviously there are times where people are doing something they shouldn't be doing, and now you're being pressured to either not get involved, not stop what's happening, don't report it. So I think it's definitely a discussion that should be had. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a precarious position to be put in that spot where you're having that internal debate as to what to do next because of a decision that somebody else made. The old verbiage, security is not convenient. It still stands. Everything and anything that we do is for a reason. It shouldn't be cut due to convenience or just because you can or just because you are corrupt.
Yeah, and guys, this is where we have to really keep ourselves focused, because this is where policies become bad practices. And when you're a rookie, because this dialogue will probably be going more towards our rookies, you're basically, when you come into the facility, you're supposed to kind of reawaken our senior staff. Basically, you got those new set of eyes, and those why questions should basically make those senior staff kind of look inwards and say, yeah, why are we doing it this way? So, it's good to make sure that a dialogue gets out there, because we got to do what we can to support people through those tough decisions. And this is a tough decision, as I mentioned, because you're balancing what's right with being accepted by your peers. And we've touched on this before, guys. Accepted is not inclusion. So even though you're accepted, that doesn't mean you're included. And usually accepted, it's like a change of personality. It's a change of foundational values. It's whatever you can so the group can take you in. And that's not what we want in corrections. We want you to connect with people that have that same strong mindset that will include you in what needs to be done, or just maybe help you meet your greatest potential. So I guess for the people that look for acceptance, they're the ones where this decision becomes a bit harder. So hopefully I've been able to tell you the difference between acceptance and inclusion. Acceptance will force you to shift your personality, shift those foundational values, whatever it is. But when you look to be included, that's a different ball game. Would you agree with that, Joe?
Yeah, definitely. When you come in as a fresh officer, your job is to observe, learn, apply everything that you've been taught, and to be put in a position by somebody else, that goes against everything that you've just been taught, everything that you've learned, everything that you're supposed to apply. It's not an easy place to be, especially when you're trying to balance the facts of a senior officer versus you just getting there, the policies and procedures are in place versus their practice. It's not an easy spot to be in. It sucks because of the fact that you have all this fresh knowledge that you gain through the academy, and you feel like that you're ready to hit the ground running, and then you have somebody who's got 20 years in the system who knows the same rules, applies the same policies, and you find that they cut corners and it doesn't sit right with you. It's not an easy spot to be in.
No, it's not. And that's why I said it's good to have the dialogue, because you're getting the support on the front end. So that hopefully makes that decision a bit easier. And we'll get to that. But you're 100% correct, Joe. It's not easy. So I got a quick little blurb for each section, and then I got a question I thought we can answer. So the blurb relates to pressure to compromise is often subtle. So in corrections, you're rarely told outright to break a rule. The pressure to look the other way doesn't come from with flashing lights. It comes quietly. It's a nod, a pause, or a glance exchange between seasoned staff. It's the suggestion that this one's not worth it, or don't make a mountain out of a molehill. What makes this dangerous is that it feels like mentorship. It's disguised as experience or practicality, but in reality, it's often the start of cultural normalization, where the exception becomes the unspoken rule. Russ, Joe, what I find that's extremely powerful here is when it says that what makes it dangerous is that it feels like mentorship. If you're new and you're learning the job, you could be vulnerable to what senior staff may try to influence if they're senior staff that's taking you down the wrong path. So they could easily guide you down the wrong path if you trust them. And that's why it's very important, again, to have this dialogue, is to make sure that you're not looking for acceptance. You're going in with foundational values. You're going in with good, strong principles. You know what the agency expects for you, because if you're looking to belong, you could connect with the wrong person, and that person can easily guide you down a rabbit hole you don't want to be in. Would you agree with that, Joe?
Yeah, absolutely. Your job is to learn and be mentored, and to come in and adapt to somebody else's suggestive behaviors, in the way they do things. It's one of those where if you totally disregard everything that you learned, everything that you were taught, and you follow the wrong person, you can absolutely get yourself taken down a rabbit hole. You can wind up getting yourself hurt. You can wind up, unbeknownstly facilitate an assault, an escape. And, at the end of the day, when it comes down to it, they're going to ask you, why did you do what you did? And you're going to say, that's the way I was taught. And of course, that's not the way it's going to go down. So, it's integral that you ask questions. It's integral that, and I've been through it myself. I've seen, when I first came in, I was in a SEG environment, and, you cuff up every inmate that you take from the cell to the shower. You cuff up every inmate that you take from the cell to the rec yard. And I've seen it myself where, the people who are supposed to be mentoring don't train the new guys, the rookies, to cuff these guys up. They tell them, oh, they're not a behavioral problem. They'll be all right. And this becomes an acceptable practice because the new person, the rookie, is taking that seasoned officer's advice as gold, as, this is something that we're supposed to be doing every day. And when it's not the case. Yeah.
And the first thing that gets lost are those basics.
Absolutely.
The basics. And that's what you want your rookies to see being done and reinforced. And I got a question for this section, Joe. I got impersonal, but we never mind sharing. Have you ever found yourself following someone's tone or suggestion more than official policy? And how did you determine whether it was helpful guidance or an unhealthy shortcut? You want me to go first on this one, Joe? Because
Yeah,
I have
you can go ahead.
So I had a lucky career at the very beginning. I felt supported. I had strong people that I connected with right away that I felt we were all aligned with the same values and principles. I wanted this to be a profession for me. I was in it for the long haul, as you can see, over 22 and a half years later. One thing is I went to the academy. I'm not doing all this shit to just step out of this profession. So I knew right off the bat that I have to find people that took this profession seriously, and I wanted people that could help me grow. So I actually found myself intentionally looking for those people, and I did find them, and some even found me, which was pretty good. I mean, once you start showcasing that you want to be that professional, people will come to you as well and try to mold you in the right direction. But one of the things I would like to tell people looking back is tone is extremely important. It's something that I didn't think of back then, but I do think of now, because when there were officers that were kind of taking me down another path. Now, mind you guys, I always had the support, so I never really went fully down that path. I always had people that have some strong counter influence. It's something you could recognize in their tone, and it's something that you may feel before you can rationalize. And when I says here, and how do you determine whether it was helpful guidance or an unhealthy shortcut? I know this may sound crazy, but for me, when I was in the academy first and I went into the facility, if somebody was giving me advice or suggestion that I didn't agree with, I would start off with these whys. Not in judgment, just more of a curiosity. Like, I know we do it this way, or that's what policy says. Why are we doing it this way? And I knew some people who were taking those shortcuts that would find those whys as a challenge, and it wasn't meant to be a challenge, but they saw it that way because they were doing something they weren't supposed to be doing. And now my gut feeling starts to get a little bit louder and louder because I'm trying to learn, and this guy is just either giving me excuses or they're just thinking that each question I'm asking is a challenge. So one piece of advice I would give here is, I know you're new and I know you're still trying to discover your way, but there are things inside you that do speak to you in these moments before you can rationalize it. And I think you have to listen to your gut. And who cares if it's uncomfortable to bring up a concern? You can't worry about that. The point is, I feel it. I want to say something, then you got to say, because most of the time you wind up falling down a rabbit hole and you knew you were going down it, but you felt uncomfortable bringing something up because you wanted to be accepted. So I would say, listen to your gut, listen to that tone. If something doesn't feel right, find someone that you can go to who's going to give you that advice. But ultimately, I will say this. I think the failure at this level for a lot of the rookies is that they don't trust themselves enough to question something that doesn't feel right. And then on top of that, they're worried about being judged by the individual who may be trying to teach them a shortcut or maybe doing something they shouldn't be doing. And I think that's what stops them from stepping up and engaging in the situation. And that's one other thing I want to say. You're engaging in the situation, and the individual happens to be a part of that situation. Don't make it about the individual. Make it about the situation. What's your thoughts on that, Joe?
Yeah, when rookies come in, you have two different type of rookies. You have the rookies that take what you say at face value and accept it as gospel. And then you have the rookies that ask questions at every corner. To me, I was always the rookie who asked questions at every corner because I wanted to know for sure that I was doing the right thing. Coming in, when I first came in, there were things that my gut told me were just dead ass wrong to do. But because, I'm 3-4 days on the job, I'm following the advice and the order of a senior officer. For example, in a cell block environment, a lot of the penitentiaries here in Texas are pretty old. They were built in the late 1890s through like 1926. They're old red brick, wrought iron facilities with hand crank doors for, 24 cells per run in a cell block, 3 tiers high. And you have a crank and picket officer. They got to crank the doors when the officer tells them to open the doors. And, I remember one specific officer when I first came in, the policy was you had to be on the level that of the doors that you're opening. So if, you're cranking the doors on 2 row, the officer's supposed to be up on 2 row. Well, the officer wasn't up on 2 row, told me to crank the door. So I cranked the doors. And, thankfully the inmates filed out. They came down to the day room, everything was good. Later on, when I went on break, I got collared by another officer. And, the officer told me, hey, look, Pomponio, I know you're new here. You're following what people are telling you to, but that shit was wrong. He should have never made you do that. That officer's supposed to be up there on that run when those doors are open for safety reasons. So from that point on, I kind of, I was picking up bits and pieces as I went along, and every shift is going to have those officers that cut corners, and every shift is going to have those officers that know the policy and practice the procedures the way they're supposed to be. And if you have people on that shift worth their weight in salt, somebody's going to tell you that you're doing wrong. They're not going to tell you in front of the officers that's making you do the wrong, but somebody's going to let you know that you're doing wrong. And, that's what I appreciated the most, because, it was because of officers like that never allowed me to go down that rabbit hole, because they seen something in me, knew, I was going to be a good officer, knew I wanted to be a part of the team. So that counts. That really, really counts. If you're doing something at the direction of somebody else and you feel like it's a security inconvenience, or you feel like you're cutting a corner, or your gut just fucking tells you it's wrong, listen to the gut, because, your gut will tell you the truth most of the time. And like I said, security is not a convenience, but, each shift is compromised in some way, where you have officers that have been there forever, cut corners, and just by the grace of God, they've never gotten anybody hurt. They've never gotten themselves killed. They've never gotten an inmate killed. Nothing bad has ever happened. They've just been lucky up to this point, but all it takes is once. And if you're following advice of a person like that, they're dangerous. And, a lot of the times I have found, and which I've stuck up for these officers, the ones that followed the advice that got taken down a rabbit hole and it led to a bad situation. They need to be supported. They need to be supported in some way. If it's not by another coworker, it needs to be by a supervisor. If a supervisor is involved and knows that this officer is giving you bad advice, that supervisor needs to go to him directly, and let them know that they're screwing this up. It's terrible the way officers are being put in these positions and they're afraid to speak up. If it was me, damn rocking the boat, speak up, because, the decisions that you make have everlasting effects on everybody. People on your shifts, the inmate population, could be the nursing staff, could be the education staff, whoever. The decisions that you make have to be good, sound security decisions. And, following somebody who for a fact is cutting corners, you could just tell. You could just tell by the way they carry themselves, the way they perform themselves. They don't have much initiative in them. They're not eager. They're not, they're just there. They make the decisions. Here we go. We're doing this. You can tell which officers, if you're paying attention and you look at the big picture, you'll know which officers are going to be the ones that take you down a rabbit hole, and which ones are going to be the ones that are going to shirt collar you and go, hey, you're screwing up, man.
Yeah, and the reason why I mentioned subtle is because it's not going to be surface, maybe not at first. It usually becomes more surface when you're kind of past their test. Now I know what you're about, and then now we're kind of on the same page. So when I say subtle, guys, it is going to be in deep of the ambiguity of how you feel about something. So again, and we'll get to it later, where as leadership, what we can do to help you navigate through that ambiguity and the courage of acknowledging a feeling and not be so concerned about being wrong, but rather let's do what's right. Because most of the time when you're concerned about being wrong, it's more about a relationship. That's why I push on, as I mentioned earlier, looking at it as a situational concern, not a personal concern. So like, hey, this situation right now makes me feel a little weird. Maybe you can help me clarify. As to saying, hey, Joe, what your actions were is a little weird. That's gonna cause one person to become resistant, challenge that, and that's a lot. That's hard for a rookie to do. To automatically, that's going to turn into an accusation, at least filtered through the senior officer. So I would maybe say, hey, I get it, but I feel really a little weird about this situation. So maybe you can explain to me a little bit more of why we're doing it this way, as opposed to saying, Joe, I know you do it that way, Joe, but that makes me feel weird, Joe, what you're doing. Yeah. That to me probably is going to be a bit harder for you to do. So again, it's subtle because you got to address the feeling. Okay, so that was great. Next part, your first ethical dilemma sets a precedent. So that first moment you're asked directly or indirectly to ignore something you know is wrong will stay with you. It's more than a decision. It's a declaration about who you're becoming in this profession. Because remember, guys, talking about rookies, day one, template. If you cave early, it becomes easier to cave again. If you stand your ground, even awkwardly or alone, you build a foundation of integrity that gets stronger over time. Joe, it takes courage to address a feeling. But as you start to maneuver through this profession, it's no longer going to be feelings. It's going to be based on your experience, and your decision making becomes a bit easier because now you're leaning on facts. Now you're leaning on, the experience that has gotten you to that point where at the very beginning, it is going to be a feeling. It is. And sometimes you're going to be right and sometimes you're going to be wrong. But once you're able to do it at that point, it's 100% true that it does get easier. Because as you grow in this profession, you got more experience to lean on. And even though you're speaking, you're feeling it first, you also can rationalize in your head a lot quicker of why you're feeling it, if that makes sense, because it's built through the experience of where you're at that point. And one of the things it says here, Joe, and I think this is very important, it says, when you make the wrong decision at the very beginning, it is a declaration at the very beginning of your career, because this is setting the path of who you're going to be. And these are challenging moments. And this can be a very defining moment for someone in their career as to who they're going to be. What's your thoughts on this, Joe?
Yeah, the decisions you make early on in a career definitely set the precedence of what you're going to do for the remainder of your career. Once you start making those decisions early on, they become normalized through your career and then pretty much define who you are. Being involved in an ethical situation, just trying to learn the ropes and trying to make it through your first few weeks of being a rookie are hard enough without being put in situations where you're ethically bound to, either report, say something, question the decision, and just because you question the decision doesn't make you wrong. Your question may be wrong in general, or, your way of thinking may be wrong in general, maybe you misinterpret it, but, that's why it's so important that you ask the questions, because the answers you get, whether they're direct or they're evasive from, the person that's kind of got you in this ethical dilemma, can kind of give you what you need to know knowledge-wise, whether or not you need to continue following their advice or maybe look for somebody different to, absorb your information from. Being placed in an ethical dilemma, as an example, I remember being placed with an officer in a SEG environment. First time ever working SEG, and I know these guys are not there for singing too loud in choir. However, as they're walking the runs, handing out trays, the officer gets called a name. So in turn, he just doesn't feed this inmate. and he doesn't feed the inmate through the whole shift. Which kind of put me in an ethical dilemma whether or not to say something, because, I know by state law we have to feed these guys, we got to clothe these guys. So, I kind of discussed it with the lieutenant later on and let him know that, I really didn't feel comfortable with that. So, thankfully he didn't place me with that officer anymore. But, the main thing is you have to speak up and don't let an ethical dilemma plague you or weigh you down. Don't think about it for too long. Ask about it. Seek advice about it.
I agree with that. Let me see. Yeah, it's funny, Joe, because you answered the question I was going to ask was, can you remember the first time you had to choose between what was right and what was easy, and what did that moment reveal about the kind of officer you were becoming? So you already answered that. For me, what's funny, as I said, I had good support, but I do remember at the beginning of my career doing a search, getting some nuisance contraband. And it's funny because I don't remember every search I'd done that produced nuisance contraband, but I do remember my first one, because it's like, what was I supposed to do with it? And I did have a supervisor basically say, yeah, it's nuisance, just get rid of it. And I was at a bit of a standstill because, granted, I know a lot of people are like, well, Gangi, it's nuisance contraband. Yeah, maybe later on I'm going to try to get rid of it. But right now, I'm trying to see who I need to be. So the supervisor technically should have told me, hey, let's write it. Let's, at least have some level of accountability with the inmate, not just throw it away. So even if it wasn't documented, which it should still be documented, how are we going to hold this inmate accountable? And that wasn't the case. That was more of, we found this nuisance contraband, just throw it away. And I remember, because I had good support. I remember telling the supervisor, well, if you don't mind, I still want to write it up because I'm learning and I'm trying to kind of go through the motions. So are we able to make this a learning experience for me? Because if we throw it away, I'm not going to learn much about what's the next step. Like, what is it that I need to do? Plus, again, it's that template. I'm trying to create who I need to be in this profession. And, I need the support at the very beginning. Now, don't get me wrong. Later on, you earn discretion and you can kind of figure out how you want to work those things out. But at the very beginning, you're setting that tone, because that rookie officer has to be able to understand what that role of authority comes with. And writing, documenting, and following through, that's a great way to learn.
Yeah.
Let's not just throw away that opportunity by telling them to throw everything away. No, how do you want to address it? Why wasn't that asked? How would you like to address it? What do you think the steps are? You were like, it wasn't. It was just throw it away because he didn't want to be bothered. I'm 100%. That's what it was. It's not something that kept me awake at night. I mean, again, I still wrote my reports. I knew that in this case here, he just didn't want to do the work. But again, I had good support there. So they basically had my back. So when I kind of said, hey, I'm going to continue to write it, I wasn't nervous, because I had support there that were senior that were telling me that's what you're supposed to have done. You're new. Let's get used to this. Okay, so I have effort equals identity early in your career. So as a new officer, writing up an infraction isn't about winning or getting a result. Kind of just talked about that. It's about reinforcing your effort and building a consistent standard. It tells your peers, supervisors, and even inmates that you take your role seriously, that you're not checking boxes, you're setting a tone, and your commitment to the small things become your visible identity on the floor. Joe, I'll have you go first on this one, but I agree, right? You're not checking boxes at the very beginning. You are setting your tone. That's a lot more serious at that very beginning than it will be, maybe later in the career, because now later in your career, you're maintaining some level of consistency. But at the very beginning, you're trying to find that consistency.
Yeah, absolutely. When you first start, you got to set the tone, set the example of who you're going to be, and let the offender population know, this is the way it's going to be, and it's funny you say the small things. I remember a lieutenant telling me earlier in my career that, if you sweat the small things, you'll never have to worry about the big things. And he kind of explained it a little bit further, as like the nuisance contraband. If you find nuisance contraband, do a confiscation form, confiscate it, put it in the property room. 30 days, they can either destroy it or they can mail it home. If it's not dangerous contraband, if it's nudie pictures, or in our case, they outlawed the Playboy and the Hustler magazines. If we found one, they had the opportunity to mail it home if they wanted to, at their, with their payment. But, he told me, always sweat the small things. When you walk down that run, make sure those cells are clean, make sure there's no covers on the lights, make sure there's nothing hanging off the bars, nothing's covering the windows. He said, that's your pod. The way your pod looks, or the way your cell block looks when a supervisor or an administrator walks in, that's your house. If it's in disarray, then chances are the officer's in disarray. So that's why it's important to go in there and make sure you're looking at the small things. We're not checking boxes. We're not doing, maintenance deficiencies. We're actually holding ourselves accountable to policy and procedure. We're holding the offender population accountable for policies and procedures. And, the more that you do that at the early onset of your career, the less likely you're going to have any major operational difficulties, because those offenders are going to know once you hit the block. Your coworkers are going to know when you hit the block, hey, this shit better be tight and right, because, I don't have time for it. I got other shit to do than to sit here and baby you about a cover over your light. If I see it, I'm going to write it. So the moral of the story is, don't do it. So, once the offender population knows that you're that type of officer, that, you want a tight and right area, your coworkers know, it's easier to maintain that than trying to go back, 5 years down the run, 5 years down the road there, and try to start to enforce something that you should have been enforcing early on in your career.
Yeah, I think what I'll do, Joe, is I'll read the little blurb and then go right into the question, because you answered the question, which is great. So again, the question was, what do your daily actions say about what you truly value? And are you more driven by outcomes or by effort and consistency? So I just want to mention some outcomes are never in your control. I would like people to understand that. Efforts are where your persistence comes in, where if you have good, strong values, foundational principles, that is what keeps those efforts motivated. That's what keeps you even inspired at a greater level. And that's what should help keep you consistent. So for me, my focus would always be on my consistent effort and not get so disenfranchised by an outcome that I cannot control, as long as I know my efforts were rooted in intent, good intent, that is modeled from my values and my foundational principles, which I will be honest with you, does align with what I believe is the agency's expectation. So I'm able to say my values, my foundational principles, because I've never been put in a position where I feel that the agency has told me to step away from that. I mean, literally step away. We may not always agree, but it's never something that I feel makes me violate who I am in regards to a moral human being. So again, effort over outcome. But if you push that effort, and you're, again, fueled by those strong foundation, that strong principles, those strong values, that will give you the consistency you need, even when you're challenged. And again, that, the inmates you're going to expect to be challenged. So that's more about persistence. I'm not really afraid if an inmate challenges me on a correctional objective, because I know I got the support of my agency, hopefully. So with that said, this is more about persistence. If they're going to keep on challenging me, am I going to keep on continuing through the battle? Juveniles will do that. Some females will do it. Even the males will do it, but it's about persistence. So again, the foundational principles, those values, that gives me the fuel to keep it going. When it comes to the peers, it's a bit different, because that's a different type of challenge. That's not about persistency in regards to just being tired out or exhausted because the inmate's trying to play you, but rather, am I going to sacrifice who I am and what I believe because I want to be accepted? And that's a different type of battle. But again, it's the same effort. It's the same consistency that's needed. So I think it's great to kind of see this as two ways, you know, from the inmates, expect the persistency to try to tire you out, and then it's used as fuel. But if it's staff that's turning the other way, and or getting you to do, or getting you to, if it's staff that's trying to get you to turn the other way, or getting you to do something you shouldn't be doing, then it becomes reinforcement, more of a standing firm. And I think that makes sense. So one is fuel, one is reinforcement. Yeah. I think that makes sense. Would you agree with that, Joe?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I'll never forget I was probably about 4 weeks into my career, and I hit a cell block one night, and the inmates decided they were going to try me because the night before I'd written, I don't know, probably 6 or 7 cases for, you know, lights being covered, you know, and you know, which could be a fire hazard. And I wrote 6 or 7 cases. So when I came in the next night, I got put on the same cell block, and all 90 cells had covers on their cell blocks or covers on their lights. The inmates thought it'd be funny to try me. So I wrote 90 cases that night and took 3 sergeants to come down there and investigate them. They pretty much spent all shift investigating them. Lieutenant comes down there to run court because, you know, there were so many, they couldn't just bring them out one by one. He just sat in the day room and ran court on these guys. And I remember that lieutenant saying, he came down there, he said, I've never once seen somebody write so many cases in one night. I said, well, Lieutenant, they were trying me, and you know, they need to see that they've lost. So the lieutenant called them all out, ran court, gave them all 30 days of commissary restriction. And from that point on, there was nothing that covered them lights from that point on, because everybody was on commissary restriction for 30 days. So, you know, we had to do our reports on a computer, and it was easy because it was the same charge. All we had to do was copy and paste the inmate's name and number. So for, I don't know, probably the next 6 or 8 months, I was known as Officer CP for Officer Copy and Paste. But the point got made. So
yeah, that's all that matters. That's old school corrections. And the support from the supervisor. Okay, so let's get to this one. Discretion must be earned, not assumed. So there's a difference between discretion and avoidance. Senior officers may know when to de-escalate or delay enforcement, but the knowledge comes from experience, not impatience. Rookies need repetition. They need to build internal accountability before they begin customizing their approach. Skipping that process under the hammer of discretion often just creates inconsistency and confusion. Kind of touched on this, but when you apply discretion, Joe, is it grounded in experience or influenced by pressure? And how do you balance learning the job with adapting to real-time challenges?
Well, I mean, discretion and experience is learned really by both. You know, by the external pressures of your coworkers, and, you know, by, you know, molding yourself after people who, you know, will do the job correctly. You know, in order to, you know, experience comes from failures and wins. You know, that's what gives you your experience. You know, discretion is no different, because of the fact that, you know, you're learning from 2 different types of people. You're learning from the people who actually do the job correctly, and you're learning from the people who take shortcuts. So it's your job to take those and balance them in your mind, and understand that, you know, the decisions that you make in accordance with policy and procedures will always back your play every time. So, you know, take those experiences, take, you know, everything that you learned, the good and the bad, and that's where you start to get your feet in front of you one by one, and you start being able to make decisions on your own based on those experiences from the good and the bad officers that you've learned from.
Yeah, and guys, I want to mention something. So I love what Joe's saying. So if I'm trying to get something accomplished, and let's say an officer tells me to look the other way on something, or, hey, go ahead and do this, and I don't feel it's right. If I commit to an action, I do ask myself, why am I committing to that action? Am I committing to the action because of the pressure socially, or am I committing to the action because it's within my professional responsibility? And am I ignoring this because it's more socially acceptable, or this doesn't violate anything that falls within my trusted expectation. And these are questions that you actually ask yourself. And like Joe said, 100%, experience leads to confidence within your discretion based on failure and successes, because they're both really should be partnered together, because both failure and successes are learning opportunities, and also successes keep you motivated through failure, and failure keeps you humble through successes. So the funny thing about this all is that I think it's great to kind of get an understanding of if someone is telling you to do something that you may not be aligned with. Again, you have that feeling, let's say, are you doing it because it's the pressure from the person telling you, again, to be socially acceptable, or are you doing it because, it does align with what the profession wants me to do? So, and I think, again, that's a question that you first may have to ask yourself once you get clarity. Because, again, that's the key, too. Don't be afraid to ask questions out of curiosity to the people who are making these suggestions, and then use those questions to fuel your judgment now. Say, okay, so now that he told me all this, or now that she told me all this, why am I continuing to do it, or why am I not doing it? And if you find yourself falling into, because it's socially acceptable not to do it, or socially acceptable to do it, but for some reason it conflicts with what's expected of you at a professional level, then you need to correct yourself immediately. And welcome to the hard decisions of working in corrections. I wish we had perfect.
No shit.
Don't expect perfection here. So I got the real test comes from staff and not inmates. And I kind of said this before, because you're in an authority role with the inmates. So right off the bat, you have to be prepared to be tested, yes, but you have that authority role. And you're also not looking to belong with them or to be socially accepted. It's, I'm going to do my job, you're going to respect it. But the senior officers, that's a bit tougher, because, again, they're where you want to be. Some of them could pose as role models. Some of them, are there for you, but are they there for you for superficial reasons? So, you're more vulnerable with your senior staff, your supervisors. So the real test comes from staff, not inmates. So what the academy really tells you is that your toughest pressure won't come from inmates. It will come from fellow staff. It's their reactions, their silence, their approval or disapproval that shapes how you view your actions. When you do the right thing and it's met with indifference or mockery, it sings. But that's the test. Can you stick to your standard even when it's unpopular? So, Joe, do you seek validation? Remember, even and this is going towards our rookies too. Do you seek validation before doing what's right or after? And how does staff reaction influence your willingness to speak up or take action? Because I can answer that too, but I'll let you go first.
I mean, as far as validation, I don't seek validation from either. I just do the job. Whatever policy says I'm going to do, that's what I'm going to do. I don't need to be validated in any way, shape, or form, because that's what the words in black and white are for. As long as I'm following what the policy shows, then I'm validated all the way around anyway. So the court of public opinion, amongst your coworkers really should mean shit to you. As long as you're doing what you're supposed to in accordance with policy, procedure, and the job, you're making good common sense decisions. You're doing your job with the thought of safety and security in place. You can never go wrong. You shouldn't have to worry about getting validation from your coworkers. You damn sure shouldn't have to worry about getting validation from the inmate population. Because if you're seeking validation from the inmate population, you're already starting to put yourself down a rabbit hole you're never coming back from. The validation amongst your coworkers, the lazy ones are always going to talk shit about you. The ones that just show up for the paycheck are always going to be the ones that talk shit about you. Very far and few between times have, with the exception of a few jam up field training officers that I was placed with, have come up to me, and said, hey, I've been watching you from a distance. You've been doing a damn good job. Keep it up. Don't worry about what so-and-so says. Do what you're supposed to do. Do what I taught you to do, and you'll be fine. You shouldn't have to seek validation from every decision that you make every day on your job. If you're the one that's chasing that validation, you need to take a step back and reevaluate yourself.
Yeah, I agree. I'm going to tell you why, guys, because validation to me, I'm going to equate towards approval. But let's just talk about something for a second here, because if you're a rookie, obviously you're going to have to make decisions, and you're being guided in the process. And I know when I was new, my support staff would allow me to make decisions. And then if there were mistakes, obviously they wouldn't let me go to points where the mistakes were irreversible, but they would be reversible. But they wanted me to go through the decision-making process and get wins and get failures, because, again, all that's part of the learning process. So you do have people that may seek that validation, but then they're also not taking ownership of the decision-making process that way. Yeah. It's like you're asking for approval. And the biggest concern about that is that could shift. There's going to be no consistency if you're constantly going around asking for approval for the next step. So I would say guidance is different than validation. I would say, hey, if somebody wants to guide me, I'm willing to listen as long as we're aligned to where we need to be. But to go ahead and seek validation before doing what's right or after, I get the question, like, if you're seeking validation before doing what's right, then my question is, then what are you standing on to begin with?
Yeah.
What's your foundation right now? Because even as a rookie in corrections, I made decisions right away that I believe held firm. And even without me having to call up someone every 2 minutes to make sure that decision was correct. Because, again, you're going in to make decisions. And then it asks is, or after. My biggest thing with seeking validation after is still, it's like you're looking for approval and you're second guessing yourself. I like the word guidance better, because it's like, hey, I made this decision. What are your thoughts? And again, it's not really validation, but maybe Joe will come up and say, hey, that was a good decision. A, B, C, D worked out. I get why you did it. Hey, maybe next time we could try this way, and you keep the person being guided towards where they need to be. And then it says, how does staff reaction influence your willingness to speak up or take action? Well, the thing is, if you're seeking validation and that supersedes, everything. And what I mean by that, if you're seeking validation because you're looking to belong or you're looking to be accepted, because that's the key here for this question, then it's going to affect you, because it says, and how does staff reaction influence your willingness to speak up? It can make you second guess everything that you're doing. Yep. And not for the right reasons, but rather because I want to be the person that they wanted me to be. Well, what about that's the wrong person? Yeah. What about the person you want to be like is not the person that does the job correctly? That's why I believe some of the rookies, I'm not saying you have to go in like you know it all. Don't do that. Be humble. But you got to have some levels of expectations about what you're expecting from this profession, where you want to be in this profession, and then try to find people that have that same connection, that same alignment. Because my biggest concern here is, if you're going to go crazy, thirsty for validation, the first person that gives it to you could be the first person that has their reins, and it may not be the right person. So I get we're vulnerable in our efforts to learn, but you got to be very careful of being in this career and seeking validation before or after every decision you make, because that could lead you down a rabbit hole as well, because now you're looking for approval. And to be honest with you, Joe, those same people that may be doing that, I don't know if you're really ready for this profession, because that's also a way of deferring responsibility of the outcome, especially if it's done before, especially if it's done before. But yeah, that's I agree. I don't like the word validation, so I get where you're coming from. I think there's going to be some people that may disagree with this because you're going to see a rookie as being new, and of course they need validation. I think validation is too close to approval. Where if you get a rookie who's going to lean on that, and the way this question is asked, the problem is then they're not taking onus to their decision making. And therefore, they're able to defer the consequences of that decision. And even at the very beginning, what the academy really tells you is that your toughest pressure won't come from inmates. It will come from fellow staff. If their reactions, their silence, their approval or disapproval, that shapes how you view your actions. When you do the right thing, like you said, Joe, and it's met with indifference or mockery, it sings. But that's the test. Can you stick to your standard even when it's unpopular? And that's where that question comes in. Yeah. Are you looking for validation before or after? So I don't want people to mix up validation with guidance, because people could guide you into a decision, but it's still your decision, and then people could clear up a decision after you've done it. But again, it's still your decision. I think the validation could also be seen as a way of trying to defer that responsibility. One, beforehand, hey, before I make this decision, do you think this is the right thing to do? Blah, blah, blah. Go ahead, go try it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Go try it. You got to trust me enough to know I'm not going to let you fail to a point where it's irreversible. But you got to go out there and try that decision making in real time. I can't be your savior each time you have to make a decision. And that was done for me, guys. It wasn't sink or swim. It was, you're in the moment. You don't have time to stop every second to go see what Joe would do. You have to be there in that moment, because the inmates are also going to see you as weak. Oh, watch this. Well, he's going to have to do an order, but he's unsure, so let's confuse him. Yeah. And then he'll keep on going to Joe every 2 seconds. No, you're going to have to stand your ground, do what's got to be done, and then get some guidance later in case there was any direction that you could have done a little bit better. So that's a good question, because I think validation is the same as seeking approval. So we got flexibility. Actually, it all connects. Flexibility versus compromise. So flexibility means reading the room. It's a strength. It allows you to adapt based on new facts or situational nuance. Compromise, however, means abandoning what you know is right in order to preserve comfort, approval, or reputation. It erodes trust, not just with others, but with yourself. The danger is that compromise often disguises itself as reasonableness. So, Joe, have you ever mistaken flexibility, which is just adapting to the situation, that's what we want, for compromise, where you start to negotiate things you shouldn't be negotiating? And are you clear on where your personal red lines truly lie?
Yeah, and that it happens on a daily basis. It just doesn't happen early on. It happens throughout your entire career. Compromise could be could be seen as weakness at some point. Afraid to make a decision, afraid to say no. Having the flexibility to adapt in a situation. You got to have that anyways, because situations can build from initial situations. So you got to have the flexibility to recognize that and go with the moment. Compromise. I hate using the word compromise because it sounds like you're selling your soul for acceptance. But it's kind of what it is to a certain point. You should never compromise your beliefs. You should never compromise the way you do your job, the way you stand your ground. That should never be compromised. There's always going to be times where you have a little bit of flexibility within your job description and the way you deal with staff, the way you deal with the inmate population. There's going to be things where you have to be a little flexible sometimes. Just not because of the fact that you want to be seen as friendly or weak. It could be just being a good basic human being. But you should never compromise, especially when it's to the point of your morals, your integrity, your beliefs. The way you carry your job. You should never compromise any of that for anybody else.
Yeah, I want to add something. Maybe it's a different way of looking at it too. So flexibility is truly situational. It's really not involving emotion. It's just really dealing with the situation, as we mentioned before. So sometimes you do have to adapt and adjust, but it doesn't affect your foundation. You're basically making your decisions based on those strong values. But compromise, I think, is rooted in some level of emotion. I do. I think compromise removes yourself from the situation a bit, and now you're more focused on the personal. I think the more emotional. Like again, some people may compromise because they're tired. And I just can't battle this anymore, or I don't want to lose their respect. So let me go ahead and negotiate what shouldn't be negotiated. You could see that obviously when dealing with the inmates. That's why, like, if I make a professional judgment call based on the situation that's presented to me, that's flexibility. 100% that's flexibility, because I'm not shifting who I am. I'm solid. I'm doing what needs to be done because the situation demands it from me. Compromise is usually the end result of giving up. And what I mean by that, it's funny because I always tell people you have to allow yourself to be flexible, but that's not the same as compromise. Compromise is a bit different. Like if I'm meeting with Joe and we're having a back and forth, maybe sometimes I have to be a little bit flexible to what Joe needs, because right now Joe's telling me the situation has changed, and now I got to step up and address that because I can't stay anchored in something that's still not working. That doesn't mean I'm compromising, because I can't compromise. The situation demands something different, and I got to correct myself. The other avenue is when it comes to compromise. Now, if me and Joe are having a back and forth and Joe's persistent, or, man, if I say something, Joe's not going to like me anymore. That's where the compromise comes in, because it's not rooted in anything of value. It's just not. It's not rooted in anything that you hold dear. It's actually sacrificing those. So I think that's the thing too. I'm not sacrificing anything if I have to be flexible, but I'm sacrificing everything if I start to compromise. Joe, does that make sense? Because we never discussed that before, but would you agree that's a good way of looking at it?
Yeah, I mean, and you said you hit it on the head. Flexibility doesn't take away from your standards or your integrity. It's something that you adapt to in any given moment. Where compromise, to me, it almost sounds like a failed negotiation, and you just give up just on the basis of being worn out about the situation.
I agree. And guys, by the way, guys, this is a way for you to look at things, because words do matter. And if you tend to be going through this, you could ask yourself, am I being flexible or am I compromised? And I think the question is, am I losing anything in the process that forces me to shift who I am? And if that's the case, then you may be making a decision that's more of a compromise than it is actually being flexible. I got a few more areas left, Joe. Cultural pressure can wear a friendly face. So not every bad suggestion comes from a bad person. In fact, most of the time it comes from someone trying to save you time or effort, or even protect you politically. That's why it's hard to challenge, because it doesn't always feel wrong in the moment. It feels like camaraderie. But helping someone become less of themselves to fit in is not real mentorship. So, Joe, question to you. How do you respond when peer advice conflicts with your values? And have you ever followed guidance that didn't sit right with you? And what did it teach you?
Yeah, I mean, when you arrive at your facility, you're going to notice, you may not notice right off the bat, but you're going to notice things that happen, during shift mounts. You're going to notice, certain groups sit over here, certain groups sit over here, certain groups sit there. For me, I just go sit in the middle of all of them. I didn't give a damn, because, there wasn't anything I was trying to hide or keep from anybody. I was pretty much an open book. Being pressured one way or the other to, do something against your beliefs. It just depends on what your beliefs are within a correctional facility. You have people that, that are very religious that come to work there, knowing that, the prison is full of curse words on a daily basis, mostly from the offender population. But they don't let that sway them. They don't let that pressure them. They continue to do their job, and they'll tell them, hey, I don't curse. You're not going to curse at me. It's and I have admiration for those styles of officers because they never waver. They never waver from who they are. And that's one thing I always told cadets, or pre-service cadets as they enter the facility is you never let the agency or the job take you from you, no matter what job you decide to take in your lifetime, whether it's corrections, whether it's being a police officer, whether it's being an administrator, whether it's being, in an office setting. You never allow another individual or a group of individuals or an agency take you from you, because once you allow that, you're no longer you. You're what they want you to be.
I agree. It's funny. I've been called stubborn a lot, and I don't want to equate stubborn to consistency. But usually when I'm stubborn on something, it's because it hit me somewhere. And sometimes I don't even know it in the moment. It just happens. You just go in and someone tries to get you to do something or not do something. And all of a sudden there's passion in your defense. And it's like, wow, where's that rooted from? And it's because it's in you, you just can't change. And somewhere along the line, someone's hitting you in that. And I remember, again, being stubborn, professionally stubborn. I'll turn around, professionally stubborn. But with that said, if it is a peer, if it is someone that, that you're closer to, someone that you have good equity with already, because remember, we talked about this already. I mean, there could be some people that you just don't have the same values, but you want to belong so bad that you connect with them. But that doesn't mean that you guys are tight. It could just be the fact that you want to belong. But there are some people that, maybe, me and Joe are close with each other, and me and Joe got equity, which allows for a lot of forgiveness. If me and Joe have built trust with each other, and we understand that people are not perfect, me and Joe have equity, which means if I, have a bad moment with Joe, we've had 20 other million good moments. Me and Joe are going to recover from that. One, because we have equity, and two, because we're fucking adults. But either way, but But if you don't have equity with that individual, then obviously that interaction could solidify a negative relationship. Because again, it could be an initial interaction. But with that said here, I would talk to Joe. If Joe was giving me advice that I felt conflicted with who I am, I would probably be, and again, I'm just talking about it in truth here, I would be more willing to listen to Joe, because me and Joe have a relationship and we've never been at this point before. So I'm going to want to try to understand where Joe is coming from, because maybe Joe is passionate about something and we're not seeing it. But I will say this, though. I will say this. Regardless of what my decision is, me and Joe should have enough equity in that relationship that decision doesn't change how we view each other. Now, I want to make sure of something real quick, though. My relationship with Joe is already a relationship based on professional standards. So I'm not saying that Joe is going to be doing something that's corrupt. But maybe one day Joe wants to take a shortcut. Joe's tired today. We are human. It could happen. We get caught up in our own emotions sometimes. It can happen. So maybe at that point, the anchor is no longer the senior staff you built the rapport with, but you as the rookie. Maybe that senior staff needs you in that moment. They don't know it. So maybe as me and Joe start to build on that explanation, I start to see that this isn't the Joe I know. Wow, this is a little bit different. Hey, Joe, is everything okay? Let's move away from this decision real quick. Hey, what's going on with you? Because we're all human. And I know enough about Joe to know that this isn't Joe's normal route. So maybe this is when the rookie, because me and Joe have equity with each other, because mentoring too, that goes both ways, man. we both learn from each other. If I mentor somebody, it's because I want to learn from them as well. It's not a one-way dynamic. So we all have moments. Trust and believe we all have moments. And if Joe was giving me something I didn't agree with that really stood against me, but yet me and Joe have equity, and Joe's never done that to me before, I may pull back from the decision for a second and talk to Joe to find out what's really going on, because you've never done this before. And then granted, if I did make a decision, Joe would not hold it against me because Joe knows who I am. Hell, he's invested in me. He probably would expect that. But again, we're human. You know, not every moment's going to be perfect. And sometimes, I know it sounds crazy, but in a moment like this question saying here, roles could switch. Maybe there is a point where the rookie officer, for a moment in time, has to help that senior officer because maybe that senior officer is going through something and they don't even know it. So, I think for me, how do you respond when peer advice conflicts with your values? I know the individual, so I may want to understand a little bit more of why they're giving me that advice, and then maybe go past the situation because I got equity with Joe and I know enough about Joe to know this isn't the route he usually would take with me. So I would not judge him for it. I wouldn't. But with that said, me and Joe have that relationship. Does that make sense, Joe? I mean, that's something that we've never discussed.
Yeah, it absolutely makes sense because, when you're dealing with somebody initially for the first time versus somebody that you've been invested in for, 10, 15, 20 years, if you have enough investment in that person, when something's not right with them. You understand when they're off kilter or when they make a decision that's normally not within their wheelhouse that or something that's not within their typical guidelines that they would do on a daily basis, versus the initial, being somebody being a rookie that comes in and deals with another staff member for the first time, their decision may not, set right with you, and that could cause you not to go back to that person for advice, regardless of whether if it was a bad decision or maybe the way they presented it to you was in a negative fashion that just rubbed you raw, versus being invested in some, having a relationship, a professional relationship with somebody for a multitude of years that's never led you astray, who's always had your back, called you out on your bullshit, whether it was right or wrong, obviously not in front of anybody else, but, having that person, and suddenly they are like, whatever decision you make, they're just kind of like, hey, it's your decision. Do what you want to do. No, that's not what I'm asking, dude. I'm asking you for some guidance here and you're giving me bullshit. What's going on? You should be able to have enough investment, and have that equity in that relationship to know when something's wrong versus having that initial, I don't know if you want to call it a confrontation, with somebody that you don't know anything about, that you're going to for guidance. It makes a big difference. It really does. It makes a difference in the value of the relationship that you hold, your beliefs, the way, you professionally, I don't want to say ask and receive, but, your interactions with people, especially initially with new people, if you give them short answers or you give them the, I'm just answering your question, but I really don't give a shit attitude, you've lost any hopes of having any equity with that person for the remainder of your career and for the remainder of their career. And, having those type of interactions with rookie staff could cause them to not come back. And that's what a lot of people don't understand nowadays. You have to invest in these people. You have to build those foundations. You have to build the walls, put a roof on it, insulate it. You have to give a piece of yourself to these people so they know that you're there for the right reasons. Build that equity with your staff, because as long as you build that professional relationship with your staff, they're going to come back to you time and time again, to not to seek validation, but to ask for guidance. It may not even be professionally. It may be something personally that they're going through that they don't want nobody else to know about, but they're coming to you because you have enough invested in that relationship professionally that they feel comfortable enough that you're going to give them a solid answer no matter what the circumstances are.
Yeah, and guys, these are the discussions that we have even at the conferences. We kind of bleed off the notes here, read off the notes here. I don't say I bleed, but read off the notes here and then open it up for discussion, because this is the management of people right now, because this is a very complicated business. And to sit there and say that you're going to introduce these ideas into a perfect world without understand that this human emotion at any minute, it's crazy. But to understand these dynamics, that's why these discussions matter, because as me and Joe do it, we're learning. We come in with a blank template, lean on our experiences. And I know I do, but I take from the discussion. I listen to Joe, listen to myself, because sometimes I even shock myself in what I discover. And then I try it. Or maybe I'll even hey, you know what? I just discussed this the other day on the show. Hey, you know what I learned from Joe or Russ? So I got silence leaves a mark. We got about 3 more left. Silence leaves a mark. So there are times when you'll choose silence, not out of fear, but strategy. And that's human. But the emotional toll of that silence can linger. It creates internal conflict, especially when that silence protects dysfunction or enables someone else's harm. Even if no one else sees the moment, you do. And over time, those moments stack up and shape how you see the job and yourself. And it's funny thing about silence, guys. Silence is never neutral. Reflective question, Joe. So can you recall a moment? This is a good one. Can you recall a moment when you stayed silent and still think about it? And what were the emotional costs of not speaking up?
I remember one time as a young CO, I watched an officer enter an inmate cell after being involved in a verbal confrontation, over his radio because he was playing it too loud. And the officer, did his due diligence. Hey, turn it down. Hey, turn it down, or I'm going to take it. Then it's, it went to turn it down for the last time, or I'm coming in. Well, he went in, and a physical altercation ensued after that. And when it was said and done, of course, the officer was in the wrong. He should have never entered that cell by himself to begin with. But I never really volunteered the information, and it kind of ate at me because, after the fact, I'm thinking, man, this dude could have got killed in that cell, and I didn't speak up right then and there. So there are things that you come across that if you choose to stay silent, it could come back to haunt you. Especially when it comes to the physical safety of your staff, your coworkers, or just being silent altogether, and somebody else sees you being silent. Then now you're marked as somebody who's part of that don't ask, don't tell clique, and eventually it's going to wear on you.
What's funny? So sometimes you'll see a staff member get caught up, and a lot of us kind of look back and say we knew it was coming, but we didn't have the courage to act on what we felt because it was too ambiguous to us. And then when the person gets caught up, I guess the context is there now, and now you have more courage to stay on the back end that you knew it was happening. And it's like, wow, I think this happens a lot, actually, where people will see someone getting escorted out, and it's like there were signs, they never acted on it. And then when the person gets escorted out, some people will say, yep, I saw the way Joe was with that inmate, or I saw the way Gangi was with that inmate. And then obviously the first question was, why didn't you say anything? And, again, I think it goes with being socially acceptable, the courage it takes to stand out and do the right thing, and a culture that supports that. Let's not forget to add that as well. I mean, it takes courage to stand out, but it should also be supported, and that makes it easier for someone to stand out. And I think we're gonna get to that in the next part. So I'm gonna not jump too ahead, because the next part is about leadership that must normalize ethical conversation. So I'm gonna say, I'm sure I can't think of it in the moment, but I'm sure there was something I thought was a bit funny. But just not enough evidence to really solidify something that was funny. And then instead of going into the argument with somebody who would probably wind up defending themselves, I would just probably ignore it. And then later on, if something happened, I may replay that incident in hindsight bias and say, well, I should have said something. But I don't know if that would even be the determining factor. But I definitely think, again, in relationship to the question, I think that happens a lot. And for people to say it doesn't, I know that's not true, because I've seen people, as I say, get escorted out. And the moment that person leaves, everybody's in a little bit of a huddle. And they're talking about how they saw all these things, and they literally go over this, everything that they've seen. And it's like, well, you saw all that, you didn't do nothing about it. And it's funny. One more thing about this. So I've seen people escorted out for sexual relationships with inmates where, you know, the officer was a little bit over or undue with the inmate. Obviously, relationships formed, and next thing you know, the officer's having sex with the inmate. They wind up getting caught up. And then as they're escorted out, a bunch of staff will come in and say, I knew they were too close, the way they stood at their podium, the way he was constantly, she was constantly talking to him, or the body language between these two, or he would always be out of his area to see her. If he was assigned here, he would go to her. And these are great signs that we all put together. And then maybe at the end, we all say, yeah, we knew this, whatever. But then let's say something was to happen. Let's say the officer was so compromised that after having sex, he brought in a weapon, and that weapon went into an officer's heart. You're not going to have a lot of people there saying, oh, I knew this was happening.
Yeah.
But they're going to live with that silence because they know. They know they could have done something. And that's when, you know, I think that's something where this next part's going to come into play here, because we know it's difficult. It's taught in you. You better see it, say it, or see something, say something. Yeah, okay. But into what culture you expect that to happen? I'm not minimizing your responsibility in it. But leadership has a responsibility of providing a culture where it's not that hard to do. Okay, so leadership must normalize ethical conversation. So we teach new officers how to respond to fights, but not always how to respond to internal pressure. That gap in training sends a message. Figure it out on your own. But culture doesn't improve by accident. It improves through deliberate, open conversation about how integrity is practiced, not just preached. If rookies don't hear these conversations, they assume they don't matter. So has anyone ever prepared you for cultural pressure before it surfaced? And how can leadership make those conversations routine rather than reactive? And ain't that the question, Joe? Ain't the question, Joe, right now, why are we not having these conversations beforehand so people are more motivated to do the right thing? What's your thoughts on that, Joe?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, that's, you know, and it's something that I believe that should be talked about during academies, you know, and not just waiting till you get to a facility to get that lecture. I wholeheartedly believe that facilities need to talk about integrity, doing the right thing, you know, speaking up, not being afraid of being labeled a snitch. You know, especially when it comes to certain situations that can lead to the delivery of dangerous contraband coming in a facility, a weapon coming in that could be used against a coworker. You know, we wholeheartedly need to have those conversations. We shouldn't wait until these people get to the unit level to start having these conversations. That should be something that should be talked about during academies. Prior to coming, you know, especially, you know, for somebody who may be naive as to what could happen in a correctional facility on a daily basis. You know, those people that say, nah, my coworker would never do that. Bullshit. I see it every day. You know, and it's definitely okay to have that conversation with these people. It's definitely okay to make them aware that, you know, it doesn't make you a snitch. It doesn't make you, you know, any less than anybody else here. It just makes you a person that wants to keep our facility safe. And that's something that they need to understand, because, you know, even you have a certain percentage of inmates on every facility that don't like the drugs that come in, that don't like the weapons that come in, because, you know, it brings undue heat on them, and you know, even they don't like it. You know, so for the offenders to speak out before the staff, that says a lot. You know, when the offenders are, you know, hey man, so-and-so is bringing this in, so-and-so is bringing this in. And, you know, you have staff that stays silent about it. It's because we're not having those conversations, and we need to have those conversations. We need to explain why during these conversations that this is so important, as a facility mission. It's all about the safety, security of the facility and the institution.
Yeah. Now, guys, I'm not saying this doesn't matter, but I want you to hear me out on something. So, obviously there's the brothers and sisters keepers, and obviously there should be a context provided to that, because there are limits to that as well. Because the brother and sisters keepers are still in context of the expectations of the job, what's expected of us, and not meant to be where the relationship supersede the trusted expectations. Remember that. I think that, I don't want people to take this as a controversial discussion here, but it's true. The relationships that we build with each other, should have, at least within the workplace, should have the expectations that fall within the trust of what's expected of us. When we say we're a brother and sisters, a keeper, it's really about being there for them, yes, but also making sure that they stay true to what has been promised. Now, I want to mention something. So obviously, if you see someone doing something wrong, when I was a rookie, I was taught that, 100% you got to document it, do the right thing, report it up, whatever it is. And when people would try to reinforce that, because it's not an easy decision to make, instead of them reinforcing it from the expectation of what the agency would want in that trusted role, they would quickly say CYA. You do it to cover your own ass because no one's worth losing your family. No one's worth losing the job, getting arrested, all this other stuff. And I get it, because at that point, that could be a powerful motivator, but it's still really externally driven to some extent. It's not really motivated in your personal drive. It's rather well, if they don't report me, if I'm doing something wrong and I don't get reported and I have trust among them, then I don't have to worry about those consequences. So I don't really have to cover my ass because there's trust here. So now, even though I'm breaking the rule, that trust is going to supersede the CYA because we trust each other. I don't need to cover my ass because we're all in it together. And also on another note, when you do decide, let's say Joe does something foolish and I do decide to write it, and I'm not sorry, Joe, what you did was wrong. You shouldn't have done it. And I'm sorry, man. And my reason for writing is because I'm CYAing. The same person that would probably have taught me to write people up for covering to cover your own ass would now be the same person telling me that I'm selfish and that right now I don't care about my brothers and sisters. So it becomes very confusing for a rookie because they're told to cover themselves until it affects somebody else that they're close to. And now all of a sudden the move to cover yourself becomes selfish. Well, how could you do that to Joe? He was your friend. Well, you taught me to cover my own ass. So I was covering my own ass. So the neutral ground for that is, well, I did it because the agency wants me to do it, because I've been hired to do that, because that's the expectation. And therefore, it's not conditional. There's no conditional here. So I know we go around, and I've done it in the past, and I get it. If I don't really know what you're about right now and I got to keep you motivated, I may do something external and say, hey, cover yourself, because I figure there's a greater connection to maybe your family or the job or not going to jail. But that's in the moment. That doesn't last long. Eventually, when we get to know each other, it's not about covering your own ass. It's what are you expected to do in this position? So why did you write up Joe? Because the position demands I do it. Because after what they did, the position demands I do it. And I know this may sound crazy, but and when you have someone that you trust and they do something wrong, obviously you're going to feel that there's a betrayal. So it's always going to be personal. I get it. But that personal can affect and sway you in whatever decision you have to make. So I may look at, like, if I write up Joe and now it's about CYA, doesn't that go against my brother and sister's keeper? Because now I'm worried about myself. I'm not worried about Joe. But if I stay true to the situation that has just happened and keeping it objective, then it becomes less personal. Even though the decision could feel personal, it's not. It's not. Don't get swept up that when you come to report a dirty officer, and yes, it's your friend Joe, that's a personal decision. It's not a personal decision.
No.
And why it becomes hard is because you made it a personal decision. And that's going to be hard for a lot of people to hear, because right now our belief in the work we do has lessened. Our belief in the people we work for has lessened. So, of course, when it lessens, when the value lessens, we wind up now going towards each other. And I would never betray Joe. Fuck the agency and screw this. Nah, you got to always remember the value of what you do, the importance of what you do, because you are going to have to make tough decisions that expect those decisions to occur. So if you don't have the value, then you're not going to be able to make the right decisions. Does that make sense? Did I make sense there, Joe? I don't know if we ever discussed it like that, but does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. You know, if you don't have the discussions and you're not brave enough to make that situation known, you really need to take another look at your professional integrity, because do you really even have it? I remember, you know, a coworker, you know, that I worked with for years. You know, we, at the time, you know, I was still young and freshly married, and we lived in the same apartment complex. We watched each other's kids, you know, and, you know, it just so happened that later on down the road, I found out that, you know, she was having a relationship with one of the janitors that worked for her, and he was careless enough to throw away a soda can that had a love note that she wrote in it. And you know, it's one of them things you run across it, you know, and regardless of the relationship that you have with that person professionally and even sometimes personally, you know, you're bound by policy and procedure. You're bound by professional integrity. You know, because even in our agency, you know, at TDC, you know, if you know and don't report it, you're terminated just like the person who committed the act. So, you know, there's a level of responsibility to your job professionally. You know, when you take the oath to provide public safety and everything else that goes with it, you know, it may not feel good when you make the decision, but it should never be personal. It should always be professional. And, you know, a lot of people have a hard time choking that down. I know I did for a little while, because, you know, it was bad. You know, what made it bad was we both lived in the same apartment complex, and her husband was coming to me wanting answers, and professionally I couldn't give them to him because it was a confidential investigation. You know, so there was a lot of things, you know, it just turned into a mess. And, you know, I felt bad because, you know, this officer had 17 years in the system at the time. And it turned into a mess. And, you know, sometimes we make it personal to ourselves. And it's not, it's professional. It's a professional act because of the oath that you take to provide public safety. And knowing that you have a staff member who's dirty, who could be suborning themselves to bringing in contraband, or, you know, something, you know, even a love letter could lead, you know, look at the Georgia case with the female, that female warden or that female captain. You know, it started off with small things that never
Alabama.
And yeah, and all of a sudden, you know, you got somebody who facilitated a damn escape. You know, it's the small things that lead to the big things. It should never be personal. You may make it personal for yourself for a little while, but in the grand scheme of things, you're going to understand that you were ethically responsible to do the right thing professionally. And sometimes those decisions suck. Sometimes they hurt, but nevertheless, they still need to be made.
Yeah, and you're talking about Vicky and Casey White.
Yeah, the Casey White. Yeah.
I had the sheriff on. If you guys want to check it out, an older video. It was a good dialogue. Okay, so Joe, I think this last part we can kind of wrap into the closing, because it's kind of like a summary real quick. So I'll read through it. I'll give you the question if you want to go from the question right into your closing. So again, senior staff play a role in shaping integrity. So it's not just about what senior officers say. It's also about what they ignore. If they wave something off, the message is clear that rules don't matter or doesn't matter. If they scold rookies for writing things up, the message is that effort is the problem. not the infraction. Think about that, guys. So when it does become something about convenience or practice that seems to be more convenient, and you start going after the person for committing the effort, what are we leaving here? The infraction and the accountability. And in our job about accountability, so now the person wants to put the effort in to hold somebody accountable, and now we want to go ahead and stop them from doing that. And then we get mad when, let's say, at a level, well, I'm not going to write up anything because management's not supporting charges. Guys, your job is still accountability, regardless of the outcome of a charge. Sometimes charges, they get defeated in the long run. We get it. But your job, as hard as this may be, is accountability, which, again, it stays motivated or inspired by your foundation, your values. But when effort's the problem, not the infraction, that's a great understanding of a culture shift in a negative direction. And senior staff shape rookies' identity more than they realize. Their silence can either protect standards or dismantle them. So here's the question for you, Joe. And then if you want to roll this right into the closing, what silent messages do you believe you send as a senior staff member? And when you've corrected a rookie without explaining the why, what impact did that have? And what could you have done a bit differently?
Man, God, there's probably a multitude of times early on in my supervisory career that I've done that and didn't realize I did it. Especially when it comes to, let's just say, the writing cases. We had a big issue in the state at one point in time where, there was a multitude of ranking officials at one particular unit that wound up taking criminal cases for disciplinaries that they ran that were bad, that were bogus. And I mean, these people actually got arrested and went to court for official oppression on it. But because of that, we had to follow strict guidelines on disciplinary sanctions, starting with, verbal warnings, informal resolutions, so on and so forth. And at the time, the academy curriculum was still, if you see an infraction, write it. So some of these officers were writing these cases, and, at the time, I didn't give it any thought. Looked at the offender's record, seen he was a first-time, violator, and informally resolved the case. Well, the officer found out, got pissed off, and it never really dawned on me that I never explained the why. And, being a senior member and a leader, a supervisor in this role, it should have dawned on me from the get-go to call this officer in and say, hey, look, because of this situation at this one particular unit, this was the direction that we were given. This is what we have to do now. And, that officer was quite upset for a while, and I couldn't honestly figure out why until I called the officer in, and the officer explained why they were pissed off. And, I was very open about it. Hey, what you say to me is between me and you. So I honestly want to know, why are you so pissed off over this minor case? So after they explained themselves, then it dawned on me, well, shit, this officer doesn't know anything about what transpired. So once I explained everything, the officer had a better understanding as to why I took the direction that I did. And at that point, I understood that, the officer had no clue what was going on. So I made a silent decision, based off of what transpired, without informing the officer as to what I did and why, what course or action I took. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to justify yourself every time, but as a senior staff member, you should automatically know that, the decisions and the influences that you perceive onto others, especially rookies, the way you shape them today is going to mold who they're going to be tomorrow. So we need to make sure that, not only are we teaching these rookies to do the right thing, that we're teaching them the right way, that we're teaching them within policy and procedure guidelines, that we're not, that we totally make them aware that shortcuts is not okay and not the right thing to do. regardless of whatever situation you're placed in. And being totally transparent with these people, making yourself approachable, making yourself, investing yourself in them so they understand that they have some sort of support system, above them that they can come to if questions should arise. That's why we're there. That's the role that we should be playing with these rookies. We should be there for them, teaching them the right way, being totally invested in them, and don't just be there for them when they do things right. Be there for them when they do things wrong. Have enough integrity in yourself as a leader, as a supervisor, as a field training officer, to allow them to go into situations, make the decisions, and then get with them afterwards and let them know whether it was a good decision, whether it was a bad decision, and what they could have done better. There is no harm in that, because that's exactly what we should be doing for these people. And for the rookies, they should be asking the questions. Your job is not only to learn and observe, but to understand. And you're never going to understand if you don't ask the question. There's no such thing as a stupid question except for the one that's not asked.
Yeah, well said, Joe. And guys, for my closing, guys, I mean, it's a good dialogue to have. We know that right now it does happen. You got rookie officers that are trying to navigate their way through, and that look to belong just supersedes what those professional expectations are. So this is really just a good dialogue to have. Sometimes I've seen it, just a real quick little thing, where an officer will come in as a rookie with a whole class. This is a great way to kind of see how influences can matter. So let's say, your facility gets 10 rookies. Some of them go on the earlier shift, and some of them go on the later shift. Now, these are templates. So let's say 5 go to the first shift where there's more senior staff, and then the other 5 go to secondary shift where there's less senior staff. Watch how quick those 5 become products of their culture. And then when they go to interact with each other, watch how different they are. Yeah. Watch how the ones that went to first shift, maybe a little bit more laid back, running things a little bit away from policy, maybe to some extent. And watch how the ones on second shift are a little bit more aggressive, maybe in their ways. It's just you become a product of your culture. Yeah. As always, guys, the show is Tear Up. If you haven't, please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Bell's going to notify every time I post a video. Stay safe.